Buddy, it's Dr. Karen, and today I'm going to do something different that I haven't done in a while, which is I'm going to do a listener Q&A about supporting bilingual students, specifically when it comes to things like syntax and supporting language comprehension and use. So I actually got a great question from a reader this week, and I wanted to just answer it because I thought it would help with a lot of the things that my readers commonly ask me about. So in this particular situation, there is an SLP, the one who asked the question is an SLP from a private clinic, and she is serving a student who is 10 and bilingual and has been attending an English-only school since preschool. And this particular student came into the clinic, to the private practice SLP, and a previous evaluation had been done with the Self-5, and on some of the different subtests, the SLP noticed that a lot of his syntax was not what she would have expected, and is just wondering what's going on, that sometimes the sentences are harder to understand because of the way that he organizes them, and she's just wanting to know how to support this student. So there are a couple examples that are given, but basically it's just issues with word order and overall sentence structure. And the SLP shared that she has worked on certain aspects of grammar, such as irregular past tense, some work on prepositions, some work on copulas and helping verbs and things like that. So those are some common things that I have seen as well being worked on by SLPs when it comes to things like syntax or grammar. So I wanted to address those specific things first, and then talk about where you could shift your focus as far as adding in some additional skills that are going to help this student to create some structure to their sentences, have a better sense of sentence structure, and also to just have better comprehension when they are using English. So first of all, I wanted to say, and the SLP shared this as well, just that she doesn't love the Self-5, and I definitely agree with that. The Self-5 is a test that sometimes misses kids, as far as sometimes it scores kids higher than they really are as far as language functioning, and it's because there are some sensitivity issues with it, meaning that there are certain kids that do legitimately have language processing issues that need services that sometimes aren't identified by the Self-5, and that is very common, and is especially an issue with kids who are bilingual or who do not speak English as their primary language, or as their native language. So definitely that is an issue. And if you are evaluating students with language disorders, especially if you have students who are bilingual or who speak English as their second language, then you definitely don't want to use the Self-5 as your primary tool to determine, or actually I should say, you don't want to use the scores from the Self-5 as determining whether or not you would see a student. And also, you don't want it to be your primary tool. You don't want to just look at the subtest to figure out what to work on with these particular students. You'd want to look at more of what's actually going on in the quality of their sentence structure and the forms that they're using in their sentences as well. And so you could look at their responses on the Self-5, but it would also be beneficial to have some type of additional testing, whether it be you are doing some additional formal standardized assessments, or what would be even better would be if you did a language sample. And if you do have access to some written language samples, that could be beneficial as well if you're working on things like writing, and if you're supporting the student academically, which if you have a school-age child, typically that's going to be what you're working on. So those are some things I wanted to just mention, that I definitely think the SLP is on the right track, thinking, you know what, I think we need to look a little bit further than the scores of the Self-5, because it's not great. Again, it's a piece of information. It doesn't mean that you totally want to throw it out, but you want to just be aware of those things before you make any decisions about like Should I see this student? Should I not? And what do I particularly want to work on? So, like I said, she's on the right track in looking at the actual responses and the types of sentences that this student is saying in conversation. And so I wanted to talk about the first thing that she said she's worked on, which is irregular past tense, prepositions, copulas, and all of those things are important. But when we have a student who is struggling with sentence structure, a lot of times what happens is that it's easy to pay attention to things like verb tense and things that look like an obvious grammatical error because that's what we see. And what often happens is that we don't necessarily notice errors when a student isn't necessarily using a certain sentence type because they're not even trying to use that certain sentence structure. And so as a result, their sentences either look unorganized if they're trying to use longer sentences. And so you're not exactly sure, all right, what error pattern are they making? Because they're not even trying to use the type of sentence that they might be missing or that they might not have yet that's causing their language to sound a little disorganized and harder to understand. And then also you might just pay attention to some of the errors that are a little more obvious, and you're paying attention to the errors on the skills that they're actually trying to do, which again could be things like verb tense, because those are things that are kind of happening or that you might notice at the word level rather than the overall sentence level. So you want to think about the big picture and the structure of the sentence rather than just the individual errors on the words, because a lot of times the reason that they're confused about those individual things or those things that you're seeing as kind of a word level error is because they don't have the right structure. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in just a minute here. I'll give you a specific example of how we could help our students structure the sentence, because I know it's hard to think about what sentence structures to work on if you don't have some examples. But I wanted to address that as well. So where do we focus and how do we support students like this? So I wanted to just point out that when you have a student who is having a hard time comprehending language, there are certain sentence types in English that tend to be difficult for them because of the way that the English language is structured. And because of that, if you have a student who has a language disorder, if you have a student who doesn't speak English as the first language and has a language disorder, or one or the other, or both basically, then these sentences tend to be difficult for them to use. And when you're thinking with a student who is not, when English is not their first language, when you're thinking about skills to target, you want to think about functionality and use. So you want to think about what is the best way that I'm going to help this student successfully express themselves, and what is the best way that I'm going to boost their comprehension, because that's going to improve their ability to function overall. So little things like an error on a verb and an error on a plural, or some of those things where it sounds like an error, but you can technically understand the meaning behind what they're saying. Or maybe that person, they might be making certain errors in their speech, and they might be making, for example, they don't put the right grammatical ending on a verb, for example, but then when they listen to somebody else use that form and they can understand it, those things don't tend to impact their message, and their ability to comprehend as much as overall sentence structure. So in the hierarchy of figuring out what to work on, sometimes working on sentence structure globally can be more impactful than working on some of those other specific grammatical skills. And I'm not saying that you never want to work on those things and that you never want to model and embed, practice, and talk about those things. It's just that you don't want to drill those things out of context without thinking about the other things first. And if you had to work on one or the other, you'd want to focus on more of the high priority sentence structure types of things first, because that's going to make a bigger impact than the other things. So the question becomes, all right, what are some specific skills that we want to teach? So I do have a number of tools and resources and also trainings where I outline, number one, the specific sentence types that tend to be difficult for students who have a language disorder or who don't speak English as a second language, or who speak English as a second language, or if they're bilingual, or both, if they're one or the two or both. So I do have some information about those specific sentence types as well as strategies to target them. So I do cover all of those within my course, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So I talk about all of those things. But what I also do is I talk about the other components of language that can impact comprehension as well. So things like phonology, orthography, morphology, which again, that can impact grammar as well in comprehension. I talk about semantics, which is also very important when learning a language. And then finally, I talk about syntax, which is what we've really been talking about today. So what I'm going to do is I am going to link to, number one, the Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. Actually, what I'll do is I'll link to a blog post where I talk about the framework that I teach in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. But before I wrap up, I did want to talk about one of the specific sentence types that I teach in that course and why it's going to be so important for students like this. So one of the things that commonly is an issue when kids are having comprehension problems is that they don't use subordination and they have a hard time forming complex sentences. So what happens with these students is that a lot of times they will use a lot of simple sentences in their language. So again, it's kind of hard to tell where they're making errors because they're just not using those skills and giving themselves the chance to make an error so that you can correct it. Or what will happen is that, like this particular student in this case study, they will be just kind of trying to make longer sentences, and the syntax is just a little bit disorganized. And so what I recommend doing for a student like that is that one of the highest priority skills that you are going to want to work on is forming compound sentences and then working up to forming complex sentences. So you're not just working on some of those individual things like verb tense, copulas. What you're doing is you're showing students how to join sentences together so that they can really expand the use of their language and really organize the way that their sentence is structured. So there are some different strategies that you can use to do this, again, that I cover in the program. So some things like sentence deconstruction, where you're taking a sentence that has multiple clauses in it and you're breaking it down into two separate ones, or two or three separate ones, depending on how many clauses is in the sentence. So you're breaking apart the pieces and the information in the sentence so that you can focus on how each clause is structured. And then another thing you can do is the opposite, where you're combining. So sentence combining, where you are taking two or three shorter sentences and combining them into a compound or a complex sentence. And what that does is that it takes it beyond just looking at things like verb tense, and it helps you really organize sentences. So yes, you can definitely target things like grammatical endings as you're working on that, but it gives you more of a context to do it so that your real priority in the activity is the structure of the sentence. And when you're working on those other things, it makes it more contextualized so that it's not just kind of drill out of context and then the student doesn't necessarily know how to use it outside of that particular activity that you're doing. So my number one thing to recommend for a student like this obviously would be that you want to prioritize those syntactic skills that are going to give you that structure. But obviously for a student like this, you do want to focus on the other 5 components that I mentioned that obviously are beyond the scope of this video specifically because we're focusing on just one of those components, which is syntax. But there are 5 components that I recommend that you address for students who have language processing issues, whether it be because of a language learning issue or whether it be because of a language disorder or a combination of the two. So again, those 5 areas are morphology, orthography, let's see, what did I say? Morphology, orthography, phonology, semantics, and syntax. So we want to address all 5 of those things, but as you can see, syntax is one of those things, and it is super important, especially for students like this. So what I'm going to do is I will, below this video, link to a blog post where I talk about that framework, and then within that post, I also have a link to the Language Therapy Advanced Foundations program where I do talk about specifically how to do things like sentence combining and some other strategies where you can really get in there and start targeting syntax. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you for all of your great questions. And let me know if you have a question that you want me to address on my weekly Facebook Lives that I do, because I'd be happy to feature another reader question in the future. Again, I will link to that post below where you can learn more about that 5-component framework and learn more about how to do some of these strategies that build student syntax. And thank you so much for listening.